București, considerând aceasta ca o
December 1989. Romania is ridding herself of Nicolae Ceausescu. Ceausescu is one of many Eastern European rulers that were deposed that year. But only in Romania does the uprising explode into violence. The desperate hatred of a people pushed to the brink of destruction collides with the dictator's treacherous suit of armor, his fanatical secret police, the Securitate. Within 24 hours, the Romanian people have won the first battle. Ceausescu never gets a chance to retreat into the bunker under his palace garden. He tries to flee, but gets caught and is executed alongside his wife. Who really were the people for whom this underground command center was built? The pictures you're about to see are from Ceausescu's private archive. Almost no outsiders have yet seen them. Nicolae Ceausescu was awash with wealth. Nothing new here. Many of the world's leaders are living in luxury and their nations in poverty. This eclectic mixture of art and bad taste was home to the man who made it from apprentice shoemaker all the way to genius of the Carpathians. We find many sugar-coated images in Ceausescu's private archive. There's much walking amidst blossoms in spring. At first sight, these could be anybody's favorite grandparents. The Ceausescus enjoyed being photographed together with their devoted staff at a respectful distance. The apparent harmony between Nicolae and Elena is genuine. The Ceausescus were a team, but also in evil. Nicolae embraced communism at an early age. He was repeatedly jailed for his rebellious behavior. When the communists seized power in Romania in 1946, he was already married to Elena Petrescu. She shared her husband's humble origins. They raised 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Nicolae quickly climbed the ranks of the Communist Party hierarchy. By 1965, he was its popular first secretary. The Romanians applauded his promise to steer an independent course within the Warsaw Pact. They hedged deep-rooted animosity against the Soviet Union. The first rifts in this idyllic family went unnoticed. Only Nicu, the youngest son, would always remain in favor, despite his taste for abusing alcohol and women. He was his father's crown prince. The other 2 children would gradually fall out of grace. Daughter Zoya will eventually link up with dissident student circles. Eldest son Valentin is noticeably missing from these films. He was educated abroad and had no taste for Marxism. The last straw was his marriage to the daughter of one of his father's rivals. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. This is still only 1966, and all is well as the Ceausescus stroll through their garden. Ceausescu is ready to step into the international arena. The leader of the Bulgarians, Zhivkov, is his first host. Ceausescu is not just here to prevent too close a friendship between Bulgaria and the Soviet Union. He came because he wants to be a star on the foreign stage and seeks a few lessons from an old pro. Zhivkov does know how to stage manage an impressive political ritual. Ceausescu gets the recipe for the right blend of recruited cheers and folkloristic show, with a big hunt thrown in for dessert. And yet Ceausescu also manages to hit a few political objectives. He forges a friendship with Zhivkov in the hope of forestalling Zhivkov's dream of incorporating Bulgaria into the Soviet Union. A merger between the two countries would crush Romania, which is squeezed in the middle. Western observers develop a growing respect for what they perceive as Ceausescu's independent role within the communist bloc. Ceausescu's film archive testifies to a lesson well learned. His show for Zhivkov's return visit to Romania copies the one in Bulgaria, though there's one important difference. The guest of honor is relegated to a supporting role. Ceausescu himself steps off the train first. When Zhivkov acknowledges the cheers of the welcoming group, Ceausescu impatiently tugs his sleeve. Other than that, Ceausescu's staging is quite the same as Zhivkov's. Folklore, cheers, and all the rest. But the pupil is trying to outperform his master. Ceausescu has to put everything on a grander scale. He mobilizes a larger cheering section and a longer motorcade. His hunt, too, is much bigger. Romania scoffs pheasants and rabbits. She has bears to offer. The overabundant spoils of this hunt make it look as though bears were fair game in Romania. They were not. The hunt for these trophies was strictly regulated. But Ceausescu is on a rampage. He exploits the hunt to its fullest, including the traditional initiation of first-timers. Ceausescu administers the beating himself with evident pleasure. Zhivkov's visit was considered a great success. Ceausescu passed his exam in stage direction with full honors. Even the old welcoming party at the station still looks fresh after a full day of waiting around. Ceausescu's growing ego is also evident from the presents which he amassed on the occasion of his 50th birthday in January of 1968. Gone are the days of small family affairs. Now he solicits fan mail by the bagful and truckloads of expensive gifts. His house starts to look like a treasure chamber. Eleanor is elated. Her greed surpasses even that of her husband. The population is led to believe that the most valuable gifts would go to a special museum. In reality, the museum received only Eleanor's rejects. The birthdays of both Ceausescus became ever grander national events. Meanwhile, Nicolae has developed a habit of doing away with his rivals. The films of his 50th birthday afford one of the last glimpses of former President Stoica. He's the bald-headed man. Stoica has already lost his job over allusions to alcoholism, but Ceausescu wants him completely destroyed. He orders the Securitate to furnish proof that Stoica was a little more than friendly with one of his nieces. Faced with the evidence, Stoica shoots himself. Even the preparations for the family birthday dinner were put on film. How many of us can afford a Persian carpet in the kitchen? The whole family has come together. Nicolae's mother and father journeyed all the way from their hamlet in southern Romania. Eleanor's mother is also present, along with a collection of nephews and nieces. Grandfather Andruza needs reining in. He's a notorious drunkard. Eleanor has taken strict measures. She ordered several pubs in his neighborhood to close. She would later do the same with 2 nightclubs in Bucharest that allowed her son, Nicu, to drink too much. On this particular occasion, Nicolae and Eleanor themselves partake steadily, which doesn't quite fit their official image as teetotalers. By the end of the evening, Mrs. Ceausescu has had rather more than too much. As the guests leave, she is no longer able to hide the fact. The hunts are topic number one in Ceausescu's films. They require ever more staff, and specially raised birds. Ceausescu is basking in wealth and pleasure. The welfare of his people does not concern him. Greed is the personal byword of this maniacal potentate. As a young man, his intentions may have been good. Now he's obsessed by a lust for power, and this happy hunter will stop at nothing to hold on to it. He restructures his security police around a core of poor orphans, whose loyalty he buys with ample privileges. One potential rival after another has to clear the field. Prime Minister Mara won't be shooting pheasants with Ceausescu much longer. His only reward for bringing Ceausescu to power is a fabrication of lies and rumors that will force him into retirement. This villa at Snagov was the Ceausescu's favorite retreat. They collected mansions and lodges with a passion. At the peak of their power, they held sway in half a dozen official residences and some 40 secondary homes. The Romanian leader was not much of a botanist. He referred to dandelions as pig's farts. This never failed to amuse Eleanor. The Ceausescus were stingy in staffing their many homes. Most of them had a single caretaker, of whom the impossible was expected whenever the clan of the Ceausescus descended on them. Only the larger mansions, like the one at Snagov, were fully staffed. They were used to receive high-ranking guests, such as President Nixon, or friends like this one, Prime Minister Manescu. These early pictures show Nicu already as a tough customer and heavy drinker. Manners at the top table were never a priority. Ceausescu even eats salad with his fingers. Ceausescu's relationship with daughter Zoya still looks intact, but as a student in Bucharest, she'll soon wake up to the sobering reality of life outside the palace walls. Eleanor is not yet involved in politics. She's content with her role as First Lady, at least until a visit to Argentina in 1973 inspires her to become a second Isabel Perón. Snagov was more than a resort for the Ceausescus. It was the main center for their personal food production. One reason why Nicolae was so attached to this place was his trust in the local farms. He was pathologically scared of being poisoned by political enemies. Wherever he traveled, he was accompanied by a specialist who had to test his meals with a portable lab. And this is one of the favorite pastimes at Snagov, imposing silly tasks on the losers at card games. Today they have to climb trees. Prime Minister Manescu plays along too. Summers are spent in the Carpathian Mountains. Relatives and political friends usually come as well. They look happy enough as a group. Ceausescus felt great attachment to the Romanian countryside. This is where they had their roots. Such relaxed behavior was kept hidden from prying eyes. Whenever the Ceausescus came to the mountains, the whole area would be sectioned off. Inside this enclave, Ceausescu was surrounded by a gang of profiteers who kept alive his image of a responsible and dignified statesman. If Ceausescu is a monster, he certainly doesn't look it. Yet, this is the ruthless leader of a bunch of killers.
Să-ți ajungă până-n suflet și să-i stingă focul lui. Să nu mai știi de supărare, să uiți de tine, să-ți fie bine și cât o fi. Noaptea de mare, să ți într-un cântec și un chiuit.
The cordial atmosphere is an illusion. Ceausescu mistrusted every one of his henchmen. He knew all too well that his power came by courtesy of people who were motivated only by self-interest. They leached on his power, yet he needed them to retain it.
Nu-ți mai face sânge rău, măi, vere, fiindcă e păcat de Dumnezeu. Păi numai tot-o dacă omul e greu, fă mai bine așa cum îți spun eu. Dă-i cu șprițul până la ziua.
Ceausescu did absolutely nothing constructive, even in the first half of his regime. All his actions were selfish, none of them creative. He did not even have to formulate his own brand of communism. His bed was ready-made by his predecessor. He could simply tap into structures that were already common throughout the communist world.
Noaptea de mare, să-ți într-un cântec și un chiuit. Păi dă-i cu șprițul până la ziua. Dă-i până te-i sătura, fiindcă vii ca un frate, mă.
The hardest times were yet to come for Romania. They would be years of despair and a dimming outlook for the future under one of the most cruel dictators in modern history. The Ceausescus were enjoying a party while their country slid into chaos. Ceausescu saw life as a chess game. He played to win, even if that meant cheating. Apart from his wife, Eleanor, he trusted almost no one. The game included his entourage and even his children. He was entirely unsentimental. The children of Romania had to pay the price for Ceausescu's sinister course. He destroyed their environment, their health, and finally their self-respect. This award-winning photograph by Anthony Suau speaks for itself. In the late 60s, Ceausescu started to implement forced industrial development. The consequences were catastrophic. A gorgeous environment and rich agriculture were devastated. The social structure was disrupted. Discouraged peasants moved to cities but found neither work nor education. Ceausescu's ban on abortions only exacerbated the misery. There were fewer jobs, less income, and more mouths to feed. And the president? He continued to entertain himself and his cronies. While their people despaired, the clan that had created this evil empire kept the corks popping and simply fooled around in the snow. At the break of dawn, a steaming kettle of prune brandy helps nurse the hangovers and muster courage for another day of deceit and oppression. The clan obliged their leader with ludicrous flattery. Ceausescu was now the hero of all heroes of the motherland. He saw himself as a modern-day dominator, one in a lineage of Romanian noblemen who performed many good deeds in times long past. It went without saying that Dominator Ceausescu was the biggest benefactor of them all. The uprising in Czechoslovakia in 1968 presented Ceausescu with an opportunity to strengthen his reputation in Romania and abroad. He refused to participate when the Warsaw Pact crushed the revolt. From outside, it looked like a heroic act of defiance. In truth, Ceausescu and the Kremlin were in collusion. Their ploy deceived both the West and China, who would now look upon Romania as an ally and give her easy access to valuable intelligence. Already in 1969, Richard Nixon traveled to Bucharest, and in 1971, the Ceausescus visited Peking. Ceausescu relished the honors that Communist China bestowed upon him. He would always remember the grandiose displays of mass adulation. There was much to be learned here that could be applied back home. Everything in sight was of gigantic proportions. Art was used as a political instrument. Chinese artists were obliged to motivate people to work harder and fight better. North Korea was even more regimented. Not only professional artists, but the entire population was trained to glorify their communist leader. Ceausescu was impressed. He wanted the same for himself, the ultimate ego trip. The next Independence Day celebration in Bucharest was only the beginning. But scale breeds indifference. The larger the masses that were forced to revere him, the more Ceausescu withdrew from his people. Ceausescu also brought back the Cultural Revolution from the Far East. He began to use art in the service of his personal brand of nationalism and forced the whole population to follow suit. Now Ceausescu was unstoppable. He extended the concept of the Cultural Revolution to the Romanian economy. His country was to set a model for industrial self-sufficiency. Literally everything had to be made in Romania, from tennis shoes to power plants. Fortunes were squandered on unprofitable steel mills and refineries. The needs of the people were being utterly neglected. They were invoked to cheer, while staples like sugar and cooking oil were becoming scarce. Energy supplies dwindled. Life in Romania was becoming miserable. Most Western governments still viewed Ceausescu merely as a maverick. The diplomatic corps felt privileged to be invited to his annual hunting party. The Cold War must have clouded their vision. But Ceausescu and the Kremlin were happy enough. They could keep their charade going. Ceausescu kept up his symbolic role of defying Russian dominance over Eastern Europe. He never ceased repeating that he hadn't dirtied his boots when the Soviets put their heel on Czechoslovakia's neck. In addition, he was the one who kept refusing the Soviet army access to his soil. The West rewarded him with a steady supply of intelligence, which Ceausescu then merely passed on to Moscow. At least some of the diplomats must have recognized the disastrous effects of Ceausescu's ego trip. His kind of communism was stifling cultural life. Ceausescu had become the main topic in painting, theater, even pop music. Choirs had to perform religious-sounding hymns in praise of Romania's greatest dominator. The artificial warmth with which Ceausescu's clan surrounded the genius of the Carpathians must have looked overdone to any foreign observer. But the chances are they simply smirked over attributes such as a river of thought, or mixed metaphors like the great helmsman of the communist sheep. Third world leaders have a habit of hailing themselves as harbingers of golden eras. One of Ceausescu's favorite slogans was that he would lead his people to the top of the highest mountain. It seems from films in his archive that the diplomats had a ball at these hunting parties. The foreign guests stand in line as Ceausescu administers the traditional flogging of greenhorns. Wife Elena was now carving an ever more prominent role for herself. With only 4 years of basic schooling behind her, she not unnaturally became a passionate collector of academic titles. She took it upon herself to meddle in education and science, as well as cultural and spiritual affairs. This Romanian slave driver had meanwhile caused massive unemployment. The balance between industry and agriculture was now severely disrupted, and farmers faced an impossible task when Ceausescu gave orders to double the harvest. The president was proud of his farming acumen and had the idea of planting twice the number of seedlings per acre. But instead of a feast, his genius caused famine. The seedlings suffocated each other. Ceausescu's own seedling, Nicu, had meanwhile developed a taste for expensive brands of whiskey and was visibly falling apart. His parents didn't seem to mind the behavior of their crown prince. As their status rose, their morals sank. The Ceausescus claimed ever more privileges for themselves. A huge lake adjacent to their snug-off mansion became out of bounds to other pleasure boats. Hotels and facilities in the surrounding area were exclusively reserved for the Securitate and upper echelons of the party. Nearby villages were razed. To afford the Ceausescus an undisturbed sleep, crowing cockerels had their heads chopped off. Nothing was sacred. Everything had to make way for the Ceausescus. The ones who had to pay the heaviest toll were still Romania's children, as captured again through Anthony Suau's lens. The world showered the Ceausescus with recognition. While the average Romanian was practically trapped inside his country, the Ceausescus traveled the globe. On more than 100 state visits, the assumed rebel within the Warsaw Pact was applauded by the international media. Ceausescu had reached the political stardom he'd always aspired to. Eleanor, too, had her head in the clouds. She proclaimed herself the most respected and beloved daughter of the Romanian people. Romania's first couple was hosted by mayors, ministers, presidents, and queens. Ceausescu cast an especially keen eye on foreign industries. He loved to be shown the latest technological gadgetry. Back home, he would brag about how many foreign patents his maneuverings had played into Romanian hands, free of charge. By his logic, they belonged to the working classes anyway. But Ceausescu never visited any shoe factory. He did not want to be reminded of his humble beginnings. Ceausescu didn't just copy the grandiose political behavior of the greats of this earth. He also tried to imitate their luxurious lifestyles. His model was still Korea. If North Korea's president, Kim Il-sung, had a yacht, then so would he. Before long, the Romanian flag was waving from Ceausescu's own floating toy. Eleanor's ambition had meanwhile taken her all the way to Deputy Prime Minister. She'd long lost any respect for her subjects. She called them worms, who did not deserve so great a benefactor as her husband. Nicolae had outgrown his people. They were too stupid, too dirty, she would explain, and too simple-minded to be worthy of such genius. To bring Romania up to his level, Ceausescu needed twice as big a population. He aimed to increase it from 20 to 35 million. The ban on abortions and a law that forced every family to produce 5 children were to push Romania into the league of great nations. The Ceausescus kept an immense stockpile of clothing. Eleanor because she was a manic shopper, and her husband because he wore everything only once. Nicolae's habit started with Fidel Castro's suspicion that the CIA had smeared poison in his shoes. To prevent this from happening to him, Ceausescu kept a warehouse filled with 365 sets of clothing, sealed in plastic bags. At the end of each day, used garments were stamped with red ink and then burned. But Ceausescu had more safe jackets and trousers than trustworthy friends and collaborators. His clan was small and mediocre. The president really needed superior administrators to rescue Romania from its socio-economic crisis. On the other hand, any civil servant too qualified might turn into a rival. To forestall such ambitions, he would banish good people to outpost embassies, or see to it that they died a mysterious death in some remote province. Not surprisingly, his reserves of new talent were soon depleted. Faced with incompetence, he sometimes had to staff a single post with several people at once. 6 ministers were active in the industrial sector alone, but they were so busy fighting each other that they had no time left to do their jobs. Such a chaotic administrative policy opened the door to nepotism. The powerful appointed their sons and nephews. In the end, no more than 20 top officials had reached their positions because of their own qualifications. Ceausescu himself moved over 40 relatives into senior administrative posts. He built up a gigantic apparatus that controlled every aspect of public life. Resources were allocated not according to supply and demand, but through favoritism. Corruption crept into every strata of society. A widening circle of opportunists around Ceausescu was so deeply enmeshed in corruption that they'd reached a point of no return. Their very survival depended on preserving the status quo of the so-called golden era of Ceausescu. Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu remained inseparable to the end. The only thing they disagreed about was pornography. Elena liked to watch the Securitate's recordings of the sexual intimacies of domestic and foreign diplomats. Ceausescu had no eye for this. The heroes of his well-stocked film library were a modern television detective called Kojak and an old colleague, Adolf Hitler. Ceausescu marveled at Hitler's speech at the opening of the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. Hitler's style carried over into his own speeches, and just like Hitler, Ceausescu sold people for cash. He traded mainly in Jews and Germans. The ransom for their right to emigrate would be tens of thousands of dollars, which were willingly paid by Israel and Germany. One particular VIP had a huge price on his head. In exchange for him, more than $500,000 flowed into Ceausescu's Swiss bank account. The golden era of Ceausescu was golden only for the Ceausescus. On the other side of their sinister facade, thousands of desperate young parents abandoned their newborn babies, hoping that orphanages would keep them alive. The Ceausescus must have known of Romania's rapid decline and the sufferings of her people, but they encapsulated themselves to the point of insanity. They had no ear even for the concerns of their own children, Valentin and Zoya. Crown Prince Nicu was meanwhile promoted to Minister for Youth Affairs. Nicu was also a candidate member of the Political Executive Committee, and ever more part of his father's game. Turn by turn, Ceausescu tightened the thumbscrews on his people. A new twist came with his resolve to pay back Romania's foreign debt in record time. He wanted to leave behind a clean financial slate. He forced immediate repayments of $15 billion, necessitating the export of the very food his starving population so desperately needed. Perversely, the chase after foreign currency facilitated foreign adoption of Romanian orphans, at least so long as they fetched a good price. Shops were empty, unless of course you were interested in standard works about the great deeds of the excellent leader. Then, supplies were inexhaustible. Romania was starving as well as freezing, and the Ceausescus and their conspirators were celebrating the new year with their customary extravagance. They themselves were feasting to their heart's delight, while keeping the average family of 7 rationed to 5 eggs and 50 grams of butter a month. Soya products substituted the traditional dairy foods, but they caused stomach aches and were declared unsafe even by Ceausescu's own health ministry. The bosses of the Securitate toasted this fairy tale regime. They could rest easy. With their foolproof network of informers, only the most defiant of dissenters dared to speak up. In the early 80s, the foreign media finally awoke to the crisis. Television crews smuggled disturbing pictures out of the country, which they'd often gathered with hidden cameras. The party went on, and the allegedly Puritan Ceausescus were now showing signs of alcoholism. The worthless lifestyle of this first family caused untold grief. Beyond their golden doors, the ordinary people of Romania lived in subjugation and helplessness. Though daughter Zoya fits the tipsy pattern, the relationship with her parents had cooled off. During her studies of mathematics, she'd awakened to the horrendous problems faced by the common people. She was stunned by the endless queues lined up at food stores. At a hospital, she could barely believe what she saw. Patients lying 2 and 3 to 1 bed. Her parents refused to acknowledge such concerns. When Zoya found out that her dissident student friends had been arrested by the Securitate, she disowned her family name and asked to be called simply Mademoiselle Zoya. Thus she became an outspoken rebel. Mother Eleanor tried to make a match with a suitable fiancé to draw her back into the fold, but Zoya simply laughed in her face. Eleanor's reaction was to put the Securitate on her daughter's trail. Microphones were even planted in Zoya's Mercedes. Meanwhile, the international press was closing in on Ceausescu. The tone of their reports and editorials had sharpened considerably. The Romanian leader tried one of his special performances. He ordered the secret police to stock a few selected shops as a showcase for foreign reporters. But the world's journalists were not to be fooled again. In retaliation, Ceausescu had them thrown out of the country. The damage of negative media coverage soon took effect. Western diplomats snubbed the 1984 Independence Day parade. Ceausescu's reputation was in tatters. The 1984 parade marked the 40th year after World War II. It was a rigid, uninspired affair. The listless command performers had never had much stomach for such glorifications of Ceausescu's rule. The Romanian Latin temperament is ill-suited for robot-like subjugation. Now their low morale stood in sharp contrast with the grandiose staging of the event. But then, how did Ceausescu ever succeed in shackling his lively, independent-spirited compatriots? Well, simply by stirring up the ultimate psychosis of terror. Ceausescu mixed racial prejudices with fears of foreign aggression. Only he could keep the balance between native Romanians and Hungarian, German and Jewish minorities. Only he could ward off the Soviets. Only Nicolae Ceausescu could safeguard Romania's future. In the beginning, Romania believed him, but before the country had a chance to wake up, the Securitate was in control. The record does show a few sparks of resistance. In the late 70s, rebellious miners pelted Ceausescu with stones. He calmed them down with vague promises, and then had the Securitate put the lid on the pan by murdering the leaders. The miners never dared to speak up again. When Mikhail Gorbachev assumed power in the Soviet Union, the Romanian leader came under pressure even from his closest ally. Gorbachev summoned Ceausescu to the Kremlin. A Romanian time bomb was the last thing the Warsaw Pact needed. Livid and humiliated, Ceausescu would later boast that he challenged Gorbachev to sweep his own backyard first. Undeterred, the hero of the Carpathians continued on his erratic course. He razed entire villages to make room for farmland. Despairing peasants were relocated into barren apartment blocks. Separated from their land, many committed suicide. Ceausescu's most fatal mistake was his wanton neglect of healthcare. AIDS ravaged through Romania. But then Ceausescu didn't even care too much about his own children. Like daughter Zoya, eldest son Valentin tried to get through to him, but was rejected. Here's a rare glimpse of Valentin. He's the one in the blue sweater. He barely figures in Ceausescu's archive. He was normally only allowed at his parents' residence when his father was away. Tough though he behaved, Ceausescu was torn by phobias. He was as afraid of his people as they were of him. He was convinced that the KGB contaminated their enemies by radiation and let them die from cancer. He was repulsed by human contact, and after each handshake, cleansed himself with alcohol. He suffered constant throat pains, which were never diagnosed. He was afflicted with acute diabetes and maybe prostate cancer as well. Ceausescu was a sick man in every way. Although he liked to be called a river of thought, he turned his hunting trips into senseless slaughter. Lusting for blood, he especially fancied shooting animals that were large and fierce. Romanian bears no longer aroused him. He needed the far bigger grizzlies. A supply was flown in from Canada. In search for food, the beasts killed people. But to shoot them, even in self-defense, meant a fine of 3 years' salary or a lengthy term in jail. All the trophies were for Ceausescu alone. If the count of carcasses was too low to stroke his ego, game wardens lost their jobs. Corruption of power is contagious. The machinations of Ceausescu and his family were spreading like oil on water. Nothing could be accomplished anymore without greasing the palm. The only communist flock Ceausescu led to his promised high mountain tops was his own clan. As always, they were simply out to kill. Rare and protected animals were knocked down like ducks in a shooting gallery. Any sense of sportsmanship was gone. Ceausescu shot mountain goats even from cable cars. If there were ever any rules, they did not apply to him. Using a special night visor, he even downed his prey after dark. This forbidding mountain of marble was to be Ceausescu's ultimate memorial. More than 20,000 soldiers were commandeered to build it. Hundreds of the finest craftsmen were involved in priceless decorations. We'll never know the precise cost. Elena Ceausescu tore up the bills. The best guess is some $6 billion, but even this was only half the tab. No amount of money can bring back the historic center of Bucharest, which was largely torn down to make room for Ceausescu's totem pole. No one knows what could possibly be done now with this largest building on earth. In December 1989, The curtain came down on this hero of all the heroes of the Romanian motherland. History has yet to relate who masterminded the uprising. Were the Romanian people alone in this? The swiftness of the operation suggests outside involvement, just the kind of task for crack commandos such as Gorbachev's Spetsnaz. Now, even the Securitate seem to have lost control.
Populare din București, considerând aceasta ca o...
Watch for the vital second when a Securitate thug snaps at his master that the time has come to save his skin. But too late. Both Ceausescus would be caught and executed within days. Unfortunately, though, it was too soon for Romania to celebrate. New leaders readily tapped into the old power structures. Ceausescu's sinister roots still spread. Romania is far from liberated.
Allo! 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 Allo!
Liniște!
Stai!
Alo!
Allo! Tovarăș! Tovarăș! Așezați-vă liniștiți! Tovarăș! Tovarăș!